story from a teacher in grades, I don't know, one of the primary grades, who gets an apple from a student. Do they still give apples to teachers? They stopped that even when I was in school. But in previous generations, there was this weird custom of bringing an apple. So someone brought an apple for the teacher, and she placed it on her desk. And then a day later, she asked, "Is this the same apple that was sitting here yesterday?" And the kid said, "Yes, Miss McLaughlin." And then the next day she says, "And is this the same apple, children, as was sitting here the other day?" And they would say, "Yes, Miss McLaughlin." And she went on with this day after day. And the apple began to rot, began to shrivel, began to go brown. And at one day when she asked the children, "And is this the same apple as was sitting here the other day?" They said, "No, Miss McLaughlin, it's not the same." Now, of course, it never had been the same apple for a moment. It's constantly changing. So this is a little lesson at the object level for grade 4. It's constantly changing. There came a time when the children could perceive the signs of change, and then they said, "Well, no, it's not the same apple." I don't know if the teacher explained to them that it had never been the same apple. So that was a little bit of practice at the object level. The natural object you were looking at was aging as you were looking at it. But even the artificial object you were looking at was aging, although it's probably at a much slower rate than the natural object. But you wouldn't have had time to perceive that ordinarily, unless you were looking, say, at a dying insect as a natural object. So that's practice at the object level, and it's also practice with a general semantics device known as the date. Okay, so apple at one point of time is not the same as that apparently very same apple at another point in time. The index was apple 1, not the same as apple 2. Like if she had 2 apples on it, that's she would say apple 1 is not the same as apple 2. They're both classified and validly so as apples, but apple 1 is not the same as apple 2. It's all the same. Another little story I can tell as this comes up now is also from the journal, etc. Sent in by a parent who took her little kid from John to the grocery store to buy some milk or something. In those days, there was no 401, so you have to cross the 401 to buy milk. Just walk a few blocks down the winding path surrounded by trees and flowers and stuff like that to buy a bottle of milk, which is probably a glass bottle. Anyone here old enough to remember milk bottle and glass bottle? And on the way to the store, they passed a dog. Took note of the dog, and on the way back from the store, they passed a dog, Fido, and the child asked her mother, "Hey, Ma, is that the same dog as we saw on the way to the store?" She said, "No, it's not the same dog, but it's awfully similar." So it's a level of similarity and difference. To say difference is to say similarity. Because he would say there is never and never has been anywhere anything that is the same as anything else. Some things are awfully similar, at least in our business. So back to the story. I'll tell you about a little sadistic little game that Krasipsky played in his workshops or seminars. I'm not telling you about all of them because I don't want to shock you. For this particular experiment, he could have been brought to the bar of criminal justice in our politically correct day and age. But in those days, people just shrugged their shoulders and went into denial. So what he did was, which is not the river of Egypt. I'm sure you heard that. So Krasipsky had a chair up on his dais, little stage where he was performing. He brought someone up and asked him to sit on the chair. And as he sat on the chair slowly started crumbling and sort of crumbled beneath him. And, he had some kind of fall. We couldn't do this these days in the university because our insurance companies won't allow it. Somebody might get hurt, and there would be all kind of litigation. But in those days, litigation was very primitive, a primitive stage of development. People just iron things out among themselves by calling each other names, fisticuffs. So Korzybski would have said, or feuds, if you go back, duels, right?
Don't forget the vendetta.
The vendetta, can't forget the old vendetta. Nowadays, the cops have to do everything for us, like the social workers. So Korzybski would say, well, you thought you knew what a chair is. Huh? But actually, when it crashed to the floor, you discovered that it had been eaten by termites. That's practice at the object level. Chair 1 is not the same as chair 2. The chair that you were expecting, due to your habitual classification of the chair as an object that you could trust to hold you up when you sat on it, was not the same as this chair, which is actually up here. And it's an example of the level of surprises also. So it's surprises that may encourage us to complicate our definitions or theories. In Korzybski's words, in no dictionary definition of a house is the possibility of termites mentioned. Although, maybe if we did the research, we could find a dictionary in which the possibility of termites would be mentioned, but I doubt it. And he would say things like, it was the non-verbal dog that bit him. Well, these days we expect to be bitten by pit bulls. It's part of the dictionary definition of a pit bull. And in fact, the law defines a pit bull as an illegal animal because of the statistical likelihood that it's more likely to bite you than some other kind of dog. My favorite, the non-verbal spouse that dumped him. It was the non-verbal spouse that dumped him. So that's the level of surprises. Well, since we're talking about spouses, on page 203 of Selections from Science and Sanity. By the way, I should now officially assign it. I trust that it's in a bookstore. My dictionary definition of the bookstore is that's the place where you find the books that we're required to read. You should know that it's one of those custom publishing packages in case they have a separate sort of way of dealing with those. So it's one of those custom packaging things. It's Selections from Science and Sanity. And what I'm going to assign chapters 1 to 3 and chapters 12 to 14. Of course, you're free to read the rest of it if you want to. And if you're curious about why I'm chuckling, all you have to do is give it a shot and find out. And one of our tasks later on will be based on this reading. It will be the only task, in fact, based on reading. You can wait for that one with bated breath. So this is what Korzybski says on page 203 about marriage. So yeah, at the label level we have the term marriage. And we have all kinds of ideas, notions, theories about marriage, stories about marriage. Many, many stories about marriage. Well, anyway, this is how Korzybski puts it. When Smith 1 marries a Smith 2, that's his term for a human being, Smith. Animals are Fido and human beings are Smith. When Smith 1 marries a Smith 2, they mostly do so, okay, that's a good qualification. They mostly do so by a kind of definition. They have certain notions as to what man, woman, and marriage are by definition. They actually go through the performance and find that they have unexpected likes, dislikes, and particularities. There are surprises in that. Not included in their definition of the terms man, woman, husband, wife, or marriage. Characteristics left out in the definitions make their appearance disappointments accumulate, and a more or less unhappy life begins. Isn't that wonderful? What an optimist. Now, Korzybski introduces a distinction between he introduces this formulation, under defined terms. Marriage is an overwhelm. Maybe I'll define it first, and then we can see how marriage fits into the definition. Just about all words. Well, but before I do that, I've got to introduce another distinction that he makes between, and I'm going to talk more about this today, between an intentional, let's say between the intentional and the extensional. He takes these terms from mathematics, and I'm not quite sure how they're used in mathematics or how he adapts them for his own use. But by intentional, he roughly means paying too much attention to the label level. And so you have a kind of blockage, as I described before, between label and object level. And the extensional orientation is one in which you have free circulation, unblocked, relatively unblocked, between the object level and the label level. I've said a bit about it before, and I'll be saying a lot more about it in the future. So that's just by way of getting us into this notion of over or under defined words. He says they are intentionally over-defined because we believe in definitions, theories, etc. And they are extensionally under-defined because they never tell us all about each member of the class falling under the definition. And this is where he gives the example of a pencil. It's an underdefined and overdefined term. It's intentionally overdefined because we believe in our definition of the pencil. It's this, hard to look at it, you use it to write with, sometimes you sharpen it. I mean, I haven't seen a pencil for a while, so I don't know if they still exist. I'm sure they have some here. And then he goes on to say, we don't interest ourselves in its smell, in its taste, in the accidental scratches on its surface, the type of glue which holds its parts together, and its many other potential uses. I talked about this before. So we are occasionally or frequently surprised at the object level, and without these surprises, there could be no change in our understanding of what is going on. Surprises are often unpleasant, but sometimes they're pleasant. Yet without surprises, there could be no change in our understanding of what's going on. Now, a basic meaning of science is when it sets up situations in which one can be surprised by happenings at the object level, which will disconfirm the expectations that we have, hypotheses or expectations that we have, and necessitate reformulation at the object level. So surprise, reformulation, and there's no end to it. For example, after death, what happens after death? I've never talked to anyone, although I hear there are people who have experienced life after death. One guy wrote that the first thought after death is, why did I take it so seriously? So that's funny too. To be optimally open to surprises, ready for surprises, is perhaps one way that Korzybski would define sanity. Many, many years ago, I knew a young fellow who was what's called a brittle diabetic. I don't know if that term still exists. Anyway, he had a small apartment near them in St. Clair, and he had a big poster on his wall which showed a big shark with its jaws open. And there's a little yellow submarine, the Beatles' yellow submarine, bopping into the shark's jaws. Right? We all live in yellow submarine. into the sharks, into the jaws of the shark. And the legend on the poster was, expect the unexpected. That's a story that I attach to these considerations. So the extensional orientation involves attention, training the body-mind, neuralistic training of the body-mind, and whatever attention training exists in various spiritual and psychological and other disciplines is going to be neuro-linguistic training, otherwise it would be mere chattering at the label level. So neuro-linguistic training of the body-mind to facilitate attention at the object level, which will then facilitate the possibility of reformulations at the label and so on. He talks about two orientations, an intentional orientation, which he also calls Aristotelian, or unsane, not insane. And he talks about, I think he defines it this way, total domination by verbal definition. So I guess we want to put this on a continuum. So at the extreme end of the intentional orientation, we would have total domination by verbal definition. Oh, that just reminded me of a conversation I overheard a while ago between two teenage girls. They were sitting on a TTC talking about, well, what should we talk about? And I just overheard one of them saying to the other, well, someone should explain to him what a relationship is. Isn't that charming? That's so sweet. Total domination by verbal definition. And here's a story to illustrate that one. I don't remember if it's Krasivsky's story or whether I found it someone else. It could have been Krasivsky's because one of his adventures was to work in a mental hospital for a while. In a psychiatric hospital. With or around people we would classify as psychotic, otherwise severely disturbed. And one thing I either saw or heard about there was a story of a man who freaked out and ran to his shrink, hysterically wailing about his death. He had just died, he said. He says, oh my God, I'm dead. OMG, I'm dead. Now, years after first coming across this story, I discovered that there actually is a psychiatric diagnosis, a separate diagnosis in the DSM-3 or DSM-4R. They revise it every year. They discover new illnesses. So pretty soon all of us are going to be in there. There actually is a separate diagnosis for people who think that they are dead. But anyway, I just thought this was about one odd guy. He runs to his shrink and says, oh my God, I'm dead. And the shrink tries to persuade him using, I guess, cognitive therapy, tries to persuade him that he is in fact not dead. He uses all kinds of arguments, all kinds of maneuvers, but the guy is totally inflexible. He's convinced that he's dead. And then just before giving up and sending him off for electroshock treatment or something like that, the psychiatrist has another bright idea. And he says, do you have a pen? And the guy says, yeah, sure, doc. And he takes out the pen and gives it to the doctor. And the doctor takes out his cigarette lighter, because people smoked in those days, even in mental institutions. And he sterilized the pen. And he grabbed the guy's finger, shoved the needle into his finger, a few drops of blood come out. And he says to the guy, there, what do you think of that? And the guy says, oh wow, dead men do bleed. So there's an example of total definition by the label levels, or the definition, the expectation as defined at the label levels. Which prevents, you might say, the richness of sensory experience. That was a rich enough sensory experience, right? So total domination by verbal definition will prevent the richness of sensory experience from affecting the label level, and vice versa. therefore, inescapably vice versa, prevent new reformulation of the label levels from changing one's experiences at the object level. Oh, I'm not dead. Can I go home now? Now, Korzybski says, since our actual lives are lived entirely on the objective level, including the unspeakable feelings, emotions, etc. That's a direct quote from him, and I go on to say that the intentional orientation which has dominated our civilization could be called unfriendly to life, while buttressing established worldviews, defending them against views of a difference that would undermine them. I was just reading in the latest issue of the New Yorker an article about the economists and their relation to the recent surprises at the object level. Actually, the surprises were way up at the label level, but they soon had their impact at the object level in terms of unemployment, etc. And he was talking there about how the economists got so fascinated with the relations among their abstractions that they sort of lost the desire to investigate what was actually going on in the world in which people were living and working and making loans and buying mortgages and so on and so forth. Korzybski is quite hot about this. It's not just an interesting observation from his point of view. That life is, that the intentional orientation is unfriendly and damaging to life. He writes, it has us living as infantile adults in a fictitious world built up on identifying levels of abstraction. The philosopher biologist C.H. Waddington invented a little term that some of us might want. He said he had a term that was preferable to bullshit, or as they say in South Africa, bulldash. He says, let's call it cow dung. Cow dung is the conventional wisdom of the dominant group. Conventional wisdom of the dominant group. So that would be cow dung. And that's what rules okay in the intentional orientation. Of course, you know, there are many competing conventional wisdoms. It's not as if there was just a single conventional wisdom of the dominant group. There are a plurality of dominant groups competing and even murderously rivalrous dominant groups. So cow dung would cover a large swath of fecal matter. In his own experience, Korzybski says, he found on Sanity, the Aristotelian orientation, the intentional orientation, most prevalent in insane asylums, where he had worked, and in philosophy departments where they would probably never let him in the door, but just through his conversations with philosophers, it was enough to convince himself. Of course, these days, I guess we would have economists too. Although they claim to be learning their lessons, this particular article in New Yorker hints very strongly that they are not. Is God so powerful that he could lift a rock? Is God so powerful that he could create a rock that even he could not lift it, could only be asked in the intentional orientation? I'll be saying more about God in a moment. And I told you, my niece Sarah answered that question by saying yes. And there's another version of the question, slightly more recursive, which goes, can God ask a question too difficult for him to answer? And was that the question? I like that. See the levels there? That's fun. So you can have fun at the level, but you mustn't confuse them with object oriented. I've got an example from the notorious Stanley Fish's incredibly hated book called There's No Such Thing as Free Speech. An example which might be a little bit more helpful for academics. He's writing as a literary critic, and he writes, as a literary critic, if the categories available to you are lyric, drama, epic, and novel, there's 4 kinds of literary work. Lyric, drama, epic, and novel, is that really what they teach in English departments? Anyway, Stanley Finch seems to be a blind man. Then you will see any literary work as one of these, and maybe a combination, and your whole sense of the work will be produced by the appropriate category. So instead of, let's say, attending to the work, which is not at the object level, but it's close as it were, because it's lower levels of abstraction. Instead of attending to the work, you will be attending to your own expectations of the work as fitting into the criteria, etc., of lyric, drama, epic, novel. And for history, he gives the example, and I'm sure we could come up with many other examples of cowdown in the study of history. Progress, decline, consolidation, dispersion. Or, to get more political, how about progressive and conservative? Shall we look at the world through those spectacles? Well, historical research will then produce events that display these characteristics: progress, decline, consolidation, dispersion, rather than the very different characteristics that might emerge with an alternative vocabulary, thus fish. Korzybski proceeds to provide a list. This is at page 35. So maybe it's in the preface or something like that. The selections from Science Sanity. Page 35. It provides a list of a few of the many heavy terms that we use in science and daily life, which are the cause of endless verbal bickering and confusion because our lack of realization of their over-under-defined character. I could start the list, although it's not his. I could start the list with the term violence, about which I told you a story last time. You could add to that abuse, and I want to sincerely apologize for also abuse. Back to Korzybski's list. Learning, frustration, education, needs, intelligence, instincts, genius, teacher, leadership, love, hate, fear, sex, man, woman, infantilism, maladjustment, schizophrenia, personality, democracy, totalitarianism, dollar, God, gold, war, peace, aggression, neutral, Jew. One psychoanalyst suggests ego, superego, id, culture, environment, just about all of our words and all of the formulations which make use of those words then are related to with more sanity if we realize their character as over and underdefined. The other day on the 3rd floor there, walking down the corridors of the Ministry of Truth, I overheard some graduate students in seminar, in the seminar room with the doors open, and one of them was saying, well, she's a kind of left-wing thinker. He must be talking about one Klein, I don't know. And then somebody else said something about Christian fundamentalism. Okay, so I don't know, but these people could easily, because I know I could, carry on a conversation and would go on and on and on and on, using the terms left-wing, right-wing, progressive, conservative, fundamentalist, Christian fundamentalist, without ever getting closer to the ground. So from Korzybski's point of view, this is what he calls it. He calls it blah blah. You've got to say it with the Polish accent, blah blah. Slight difference, subtle difference. Now, of course, the solution is not to get rid of over and underdefined terms, because that's what language gives us to work with. over and underdefined terms. They aren't inherently necessarily over and underdefined. So what we have from Korzybski's point of view is a challenge to practice. Later on, maybe towards the end of the term, I'll be introducing you to a set of devices that are post-general semantics that were concocted by some followers. What's the opposite of a precursor of general semantics? Invented a thing called the meta model, which was a classification of language patterns. And they invented a set of questions that you could ask carefully when involved in discussion or conversation with self or others in order to bring the meaning of the terms down closer to the object level, to lower levels of abstraction. And there's, I think, 12 or 13 patterns. I'll just mention one here because it's very close to what Korzybski is calling over and underdefined terms. They talk about nominalization. Most, not all of these terms on Korzybski's list are nouns, nominalizations. Now, a noun, according to the meta model, is a word which takes a process at the event and or object level, takes a process and changes it into a thing. So it's closely related to the notion with which you are familiar with reification or thingification. Now, a lot of us have come across something like this from various angles and various places, but the meta model is going to give you a set of tools, and we're building up other tools on the way to the meta model. The meta model will give you a set of tools with which you can not merely point them out, well, that's reification. You can also do something to take it down, out of the land of reification. So basically, it's a matter of asking questions. Like, for example, let's take violence. Okay, so you would ask, well, who specifically acting violently, using the prime there, acting violently. So already you have an action rather than a thing called violence. Well, who specifically acting violently, and how specifically acting violently, and in relation to what? You got the answer to that? So, well, in every case there will be a somewhat different answer. And in the case of the mock kidnapping, the amnesty-sponsored mock kidnapping in my All 320 class, the answer would be two guys who came into the classroom, put their hand on somebody's shoulder and said, "Come with us." So instead of arguing, that was violent, that was not violent, just, well, no, it wasn't, you would have a question that would immediately bring the discussion down a level or two or three, and then the discussion could proceed from there. There may still be some problems with the market. Take a noun like maladjustment. The other day I was wondering about a refugee in connection with the question of the Palestinian refugees. Is a refugee someone who's actually been displaced from his or her home? Or would it include the children of such a person? Or might it include the grandchildren of such a person? Would it include the great-grandchildren of such a person? Okay, while I was doing research on the movement, which I haven't done for quite a while, because the movement is more or less dead as a doornail, but I came across, you see how old this is? This is a computer printout from what? From 1780s? Just as an example of just in relation to this question of blah blah, etc. Is God so powerful? Okay, there's a guy writing in his reminiscences of experience in a Korzybski seminar. He writes in, his name is William D. Hammond. He's age 80. Wow, good for him. Still a retired Unitarian minister, violating all our expectations of a person 80 years old. So, the minute you see age 80, you forget about the person and you think, oh, how wonderful, still writing at age 80. Went to U of Chicago Graduate Divinity School. undecided between some kind of liberal ministry and teaching philosophy of religion in college. There, required courses in theology sent, I'll go back to the first person, he's right, the first person. Required courses in theology sent me up the wall. Some older students, hearing me gripe and groan about theology, would say, "You ought to go down the street and take a seminar with Count Korzybski." After hearing that repeatedly for 3 years, he did that. Eventually 3 seminars. Skip, skip, skip. It's the second or third session. Korzybski is talking about the self-reflexiveness of words. There can be words about words, and words about words about words. Sometimes when people think they are talking about the non-verbal world, they're actually just talking about other words. In fact, most philosophy and all theology, Korzybski said, is blah blah about tra-tra. Is it identity, or is it no, we can use them. Is blah blah about tra-tra. He did say most philosophy and all theology, though. I'm going to dispute that in a moment. Is blah blah about tra-tra, in a matter-of-fact way. Now, the whole concept then, I think, of general semantics explodes into meaning for me in an instant. Insight into my struggles with theology flashes into sudden clarity. I burst into a roar of delighted laughter, and find I'm the only person in the room making a sound. Indeed, I'm getting some puzzled and many reproving glares. Sounds like upper communion. Anyway, so shortly after that, because he made himself, he made a fool of himself, Korzybski calls him up to have a little talk with him, and that's not all that relevant. He goes to his conclusion, which is here. So I've wondered, what if Korzybski had just said that philosophy and theology involve a lot of high-order abstractions about a lot of other high-order abstractions? That is certainly and specifically what he was getting at. But if he had put it that way, would the sudden experience of illumination have come to me? If I hadn't told a story about the dead man and his bleeding finger, would that same sudden experience of illumination that you had a few moments ago have come to you? He certainly didn't feel needled. Anyway, more. Soon after that, he found himself being able to handle his studies in the Graduate School of Divinity at the University of Chicago, and actually enjoying it and making progress. And soon after that, I made my first version of the baggage tag that has been on my study and office boards throughout my career. So that would be for decades. It is pasteboard with strings attached via a punched hole. So this is what the Reverend William Hammer put on the wall of his office. He got a baggage tag, yes, something like this, and he punches a hole in it. On it is one word, God. And I don't know if he put these strings on. Yes, it is pasteboard with strings attached via a punched hole. On it is one word, God, and the silently inferred question is, to what, if anything, in the world that is not words, shall this symbol be tied? So that helps him to, with his physicist father and liberal Baptist mother, evolve into a theologian with his feet on the ground, so to speak. Now, a little bit, some years after coming across this story, I read a book by one of my favorite theologians, who is in fact a recovered Heideggerian, and he becomes a follower of Jacques Derrida. And some of you may have already guessed who it is, and that's John Caputo. He could be classified as a liberal Catholic theologian. I'm sure there's lots of problems being a Derridian in the church in the United States. But he does all right. And he wrote a book called The Weakness of, he's written many books, but one of his latest is called The Weakness of God. Now this is related to a whole slew of philosophical developments lately in continental philosophy that are playing with the notion of weakness, weak theory, stuff like that we can't get into here. But this is what Caputo does, right? I mean, in a very different vein. I have taken God, he says, the name of God, what is happening in the name of God, as my subject matter. Look what he's doing there. I have taken God, the name of God, because that's what it is, a name, and then what is happening in the name of God. So we've arrived at the object level, not at the event level. What is happening? What is happening in the name of God? That's what Hammond was doing here. What is happening in the name of God? And then he concludes, the name of God harbors an event. Now here's a slew of nominalizations that are at a lower level of abstraction than the name of God. And these are examples of the kind of happenings or events that Caputo could be referring to. Compassion, repentance, forgiveness, surrender, desire for a better world, etc. Which is another general semantics device, which is kind of self-explanatory. And in a sidebar here I have a link to John Lennon, who wrote not a book, but a song. He did write some books too in his early career, bad poetry. But the song, the first line of it is, God is a concept by which we measure our pain. Have you ever heard that song? God is a concept by which we measure our pain. So Hammond and Caputo and John Lennon are not saying that God is a meaningless term. That is of no value for you. They're saying in very different ways something quite different. And I don't know, of course, if he would like it, because he himself personally really was a hard-headed engineer. But I gave you a quote a little while ago about poetry, which admits that in a few lines of poetry there could be more human value than many scientific tomes. So maybe he will be all right with this. Now, the Aristotelian orientation often involves a sort of implicit presupposition. I guess if it's presupposition, it's going to be implicit definition of teleology. Well, you wouldn't be surprised to find a connection between the names Aristotle and teleology. But teleology takes a different form for us who live under the reign of technologism than it did in Aristotle's time. By that I mean, by the use of this term, that the classification of a phenomenon in nature, it's the notion or presupposition that the classification of a phenomenon in nature, for example, a woman, gives you its natural or essential purpose, telos. The presupposition that our reason can discover the purpose given by nature for everything that occurs in nature. Of course, in the gloss given to this by St. Thomas Aquinas, the theories really developed to the utmost, that our divinely assisted reason can discover the purpose given by nature for everything that occurs in nature. Okay, so the modern version of this is a kind of utilitarianism. That's what I just call technologism, which supposes that all we need attend to in anything is its use or usefulness to human beings. go back to Korzybski's little talk about the pencil. He writes, our attention is restricted to its use for us, remember? We don't interest ourselves in its smell, taste, etc., etc., etc. Table is obviously used for writing on and putting pizzas on. It's used for holding things, computers, bottles. However, if this kind of furniture hadn't been invented in our culture, what appears to us as a table, which is used for putting things on, might instead be seen as, for example, well, not this one because it's not a wooden table, but 4 quite useful sticks absurdly surmounted by a pointless slab of wood. So if you didn't know what a table was, then you might see it and you'd be closer to the purity of the object level as 4 quite useful sticks absurdly surmounted by a pointless slab of wood. Now, teleologies and quasi-teleologies, which predefine the correct uses of things, obviously greatly limit the possibilities of human existence. And they have done so quite ferociously, actually. For example, with the concept of perversion. Okay, now at this point, we have to abandon the philosophy of discipline, philosophy, political theory, and move maybe to diversity studies. I think that would be a mistake. A pencil is a pencil. That is its true function, its natural use. Lousy example, but since I started with a little statement, like to think of using it, for example, to clean your ears. You won't be punished for that unless you do it right in front of your mother. You can think of all sorts of other things that you can do with a pencil. Those would be considered absurd, pointless, mad, stupid, and literally perverse. Because the definition of perversion is to use a thing contrary to its natural use, contrary to natural purpose. To use for an unnatural purpose. You know that homosexuality was once and still is at various levels of social mind defined as the great crime against nature. So, the woman. What is the natural use of a woman? We could talk about men, but we make it much more obvious if we talk about women, for reasons which we need not go into here. Her natural role, well, there are a number of possibilities. A woman can be a mother, wife, or she can be a prostitute of varying degrees of appreciation, monetary appreciation. Or she can be a nun, or she can be a spinster, or she can be a witch. I think that gives you more or less the medieval set of uses of a woman. Now, they're all legit except for witch. Witch was not a legit use. It's already the natural role of woman. And you know, of course, that the sexual activities of witches are crucially involved in their definition as deserving of death, etc., etc. And they should have known when they got into it what risks they were taking. Okay, we have various types of sexual expressions, such as oral sex. Remember Bill Clinton saying he never had sex with that woman? Well, if Bill Clinton can talk about it, I suppose I can, right? and other non-procreative sexual practices. They were, until very, very recently, you're too young to really appreciate how recently this was, because we're so recent ourselves. They're not only illegal, but really considered very, very, very nasty and or sick. Given that the telos of sexuality is procreation. And the Bible tells us in Leviticus that this is the only line from Leviticus actually that is any use to a particular stripe of anti-gay Christian fundamentalists. It's the only line in Leviticus that they're familiar with. There's lots in there, but this is the one they like because it's useful for them. A man who lies with another man as if he were a woman shall be taken to the gates of the city, and there he shall be stoned with stones until he is dead. Remember correctly. There's nothing in the Bible about women lying with another woman as though she were a man. Right down to the time of Queen Victoria, who, as you may know, kept lesbianism out of the British criminal code because she didn't think that such a thing was possible.
Is that progressive or conservative?
Yes. So I'm giving you these examples, because it's too early to talk about the tropianders. Anyway, these intentional formulations could be, and still are to a certain extent, enforced extensionally at the object by the auto da fe, which was the medieval European burning at the stake scene. The origin of the term faggot comes from little pieces of wood that are used to burn homosexuals at the stake. So you could say one of the natural uses of fire, not one of the natural purposes of fire, is to burn witches, heretics, etc. Thus, actually, perhaps saving their souls. For some people, this was compassionate work, the burning of witches and heretics and such like. Because that moment before death, the priest was right there with them, and they had an opportunity to get their soul out of, save their soul from a fate worse than burning at the stake. Marriage is intended to unite men and women for purposes of procreation, and there's a debate going on now. And I'm not saying that the opponents of untraditional marriage don't have any argument to make, because I've seen some of the arguments, and some of them are very well thought out and logically argued arguments that do actually refer to the actual goings on of the object, or and especially the possible consequences that they foresee that might be happening with the object. But let's go back to, I have a joke first. This comes from my nephew, Jonah. I don't know if you made it up, but anyway, there's this tired old aphorism about teaching a man to fish. You give a man to fish, and he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, and he can feed himself for the rest of his life. Is that a progressive or a conservative aphorism? So Jonah's version of it is like this. If you can build for a man a fire, he will be warm for the rest of the day. But if you set the guy on fire, he'll be warm for the rest of his life. Jonah didn't make it up. All right, I love it. It's hot. So I'll go back here a little bit and make a connection with Krzyzewski's most radical formulation about human nature. And this is from a work that precedes Science and Sanity. It's from one of the chapters or allied bits in The Manner of Humanity. It's called Time Binding, the General Theory. We were talking about the woman nature, right? Female nature. So we've gone to, human nature. But Korzybski likes to approach things via mathematics, as we'll see if we read the non-assigned chapters of science and so on. And he's writing here about the fate of Euclidean geometry. Euclidean geometry sort of corresponding or going along with Aristotelian cosmology and science. And he rolls out these names of people, late 19th, early 20th century mathematicians who invented non-Euclidean geometries. He writes, until Gauss, Lobachevsky, Bolyai, Riemann, etc., the only one there that I've heard of is Riemann. The Euclidean geometry was believed to be the geometry of the space. So let's map it on the structure of the curvature. Here we have what is going on. Here we have a Euclidean geometry, which tells us everything we need to know about the true nature of space, because geometry is the science of looking at spatial formations and their relations to it. The moment a second geometry was produced, just as good, self-consistent, yet contradictory to the old one, the geometry became a geometry. The same thing happened to man. One among the infinity of possible ones. Right, this is no French-speaking post-structuralist. This is a Polish engineer writing in 1924. The man became a man, the conceptual construction, one among the infinity of possible ones. So, when he uses the term infinity, that's a mistake, because I don't think he really means it. It's a kind of hyperbolic way of saying a very great many. A very great many possible ways of defining human nature, and therefore of constructing human nature. Now, of course, that wouldn't mean anything goes. I mean, increasingly, it seems, with advances in the science of genetics, anything might go. But even that would have limits. So within limits, a great plurality of many different ways of defining and therefore of constructing human life, or human existence, or human nature, or the nature of man. So to use our devices, man 1 is not man 2. Man in 500 BC, although this will astonish the Straussians, is not the same as man in 2000 AD. That's the date. Yes? And man, the very same man, let's say man 1 in context A, is not the same as the very same man in context B. My favorite example is Hitler. I think I already gave you the example of Hitler from the great German movie Downfall, which is based on Hitler's last days. So you see Hitler in his last days in a bunker, and he's being very nice. We know that Hitler was a very nice man. He was nice to dogs, he was nice to children, he was nice to his servants, he was nice to Eva, he was nice to the people who did menial work around him. In fact, I read somewhere the story that he insisted that they should eat before he and his big shot generals, etc. They should be served first. After all, Nazism was National Socialism. And yet, he was given to murderous tantrums and other homicidal schemes, as we know. In fact, that's all we know. There's no etc. when it comes to Hitler. We need our monsters, and we need our monsters to be monochromatic. But one of the things this movie does is to give us a variety of colors there. So one of Hitler's, I think a young woman who was serving food there, She's talking to Hitler's wife or lover, or they didn't actually get married, I think, until their last day on Earth, Eva Braun. And she's saying to Eva Braun that Adolf Hitler is such a wonderful man, he's so nice to everyone, and yet sometimes he does things that are absolutely horrifying. And Eva Braun says, yes, but that is when he is being the Führer, of course. Right? So there's a context. There's the context of Führer, or leadership. I just heard another story lately about Stalin, which is along somewhat the same lines. Stalin had a boy, I don't know what his name was, Yevgeny, or something like that. He was going to school with the other kids, but he was Stalin, and he was throwing his weight around in the schoolroom, persecuting fellow students and teachers by saying, "You can't do that to me, I am Stalin." And the word got back to Stalin. He called the kid on the carpet and said to him, "Listen, you little, right? You're not Stalin, and I'm not Stalin." Stalin is Soviet power. So there's another example of levels of abstraction and of the chain of things. And Saddam Hussein wrote romantic novels. We just assume that they're crap. Why? If someone would translate them into English and publish them into Harlequin romance covers, who knows what high quality they are.
I've heard some translations.
Yeah.
Not particularly good, I think.
But neither are the Harlequin books, so,
All right, I'm surprised that they didn't translate.
I think they were just excerpts, probably from the company.
Because I was talking once to an Iraqi who turns out to be from Kurdistan. It's a little bit different. I was making the suggestion about translating Saddam's novels, and he was saying, no. Okay, well, don't want to waste too much time with stories, although, at the same time, I believe that stories are really important. So we go back to, I was going to give you a little task, I'll give it to you next week, that would have to do with sound practice, not outside the skin, but inside the skin. Does that make your skin crawl? Don't worry. It has to do with, it's actually a lot like some Buddhist meditation practices. But in the context of this class, it's not the same as Buddhist meditation. Now what I want to do is go back to the Trobrianders. Remember the Dorothy Lee's book, Freedom and Culture, Chapter 10, which was published as an essay and etc. Malinowski saw the village as concentric circles of huts. But Dorothy Lee, studying the hunter-gatherer, Trobriander language, thought that a better translation would be aggregates of bumps. Well, first I'm going to give you what I have here, and then I'm going to share with you something I discovered just very recently. This is the first year that I'm mentioning it. That comes out of the work of a colleague at York named Sam Mallin. So if anyone has a chance to look into the Mallin phenomenon, leave it up to you whether you want to do that or not. But it's got a book this big, out of which I wrote these many notes. Did I show you this before? He's got 400 pages. I wrote 10 pages of notes. And out of those 10, and then I took notes on the notes, which I recommend to you as a studying device. I took notes on the notes, so it's down to 1 page. I'm sure Professor Mallin will be appalled at having this actually very interesting book called Art, Line, and Font reduced to 1 page, but I'm not reducing the whole book. I just picked out what is useful for me here. And it's this kind of relation with the Trobrianders that I'm going to develop. Well, I don't know if I'll get to Mallin today. Dorothy Lee, she points out that a circle is a form of line, and that the Trobrianders don't live life, they don't live time on a line. We live time on a line, past, present, future. In fact, we take this so much for granted that it's one of the sort of indubitable substructures of a lot of our philosophy and psychology, up to and including phenomenology. Heidegger's being towards death, right? It's life on the line. For example, in sex, so here it comes, this is what you've been waiting for. This is right out of Lee's book, so she could write it in 1955, so I guess I can talk about it in 2009. Trobriand sexuality, according to her sources, and it's really hard to believe, Trobriand sexuality was not oriented towards climax or orgasm. It could happen, but it wasn't oriented towards climax or orgasm. Rather, it was. Okay, let's use the structural differential. We think of climax or orgasm as in the nature of sex. Let's put the sex down here. But for the Trobrianders, it's not that line. Foreplay. Do we still talk about foreplay? Foreplay, etc., orgasm. What the Trobrianders put there is an aggregate of pleasurable experiences. An aggregate of pleasurable experiences. It's just like the village, it's an aggregate of bumps. Sexuality is an aggregate of pleasurable experiences. So they don't live sex on a line, and they don't live life on a line either. For the Trobriander, a life is not a single linear project, which can be characterized either as success or as failure. No winners and no losers. The Trobriander couldn't say, this is not Lee, this is me. Trobriander could never think or say, I am a failure. I mean, the Trobriander might think something like, I really could have done a better job growing those yams. That is mostly what they do, is grow yams. Wouldn't have gone from there a few levels of abstraction higher. I am a failure. My life is ruined. Now, I know that some of you are graduate students and some of you are almost graduate students, and I've heard many of your kind say things like, if I don't get into Harvard graduate school, my life is ruined.
I didn't, and my life is ruined.
What's that? Your life is ruined.
Is ruined.
Okay. Now you're just a photographer, right?
Videographer, yeah.
Okay. So what is it really? Okay, let's go back to the circles. What is a Trobriander village really? You're ready for this now. I can't ask you the question anymore. It's ruined for you. That question, what is X really, is just ruined for you, isn't it? And it's gonna, if you think it's in tatters now, just wait till December. Well, Plato would say that the Trobrianders are kidding themselves, that they're living in the cave, that they're in denial of the lion. They're in denial of the lion. Do they have words? Do you know it really is, from a Platonic point of view, concentric circles of X. Because for Plato, the line is sort of the form of forms, the mathematical object is the form of forms. Now, Dorothy Lee does something really funny here, because she wrote two books which sort of, to use the postmodern term, valorize the life experience of hunter-gatherer peoples. And the Trobrianders are not hunter-gatherers anymore, but they're still sort of extremely underdeveloped society, technologically speaking. And yet at the end of this article, we find her saying, hey, these are just two different codifications of reality. and neither one of them is superior to the other. We have a lineal codification of reality, and that fits our experience of the Trobrianders' acts better for us. And they have this sort of non-linear way of codifying reality, and that fits with their experience of their villages for us. So there's a little bit of bias there in favor of the Trobrianders, maybe because, after all, it's their villages. But there's also maybe a little bit of a counter prejudice in favor of us because we have geometry. And geometry can give us the truth of the line. I think that this is an example of, did I warn you that I might do this, Albert? This is an example of what the Straussians call esoteric writing, or that has to do with the, Leo Strauss wrote either a book or a long essay called Writing and the Art of Writing and the Persecution of the. I think Dorothy Lee realized that the sort of aspersions that she was casting on the American way of life there, and I think being a Greek woman wouldn't help very much in 1955, but the aspersions that she was casting on the American way of life might have been sort of unpalatable to her readers. I mean, anyone who read her carefully would see right through this, but at least in this article, she's pretending to go for a kind of neutral, value-free pluralism and celebrating diversity. It's good for the Trobrianders, it's good for them, it's good for us, it's good for us. But I don't think so. So years and years and years after reading Dorothy Lee, and by the way, I once gave a course here, a half course called New Epistemology and Libertarian Socialism. And the new epistemologies were not what you would expect. They were Americans. They were Dorothy Lee, Gregory Bateson, folks like that. And Dorothy Lee's book was one of the 4 books that we read in that course. So as you can see, I value her work highly, and I still do. And by the way, she's almost as unknown as Korzybski. Mention Dorothy Lee to an anthropologist, they'll go, who? This is what happens. Sic transit gloria mundi. Right?
Correct.
I learned that last time. Now, Sam Mallin, I'm not going to try and characterize his work for you because that would be too much. But I will tell you what I took out of it because it fits so well with what we're saying about the Trobrianders not living life on the line. Mallin says that there are 2 kinds of line. There is a sinuous line, which he says is natural or closer to nature, in Korzybski's terms, to the object level, which is where we live our lives, except insofar as it's being truncated and distorted, etc., by the intentional orientation. And then there's the regularized. So, I'm going to go to my notes. He relates this to his discussion of technologism or technologistics, which is very heavily influenced by Heidegger, but that's okay. And this is how he defines, and I'm going to relate technologistics to the Aristotelian orientation, the intentional orientation, and so on. Okay, this is one of his definitions of, I'll just call it technology. Okay, let's call it technology. Faith in the legitimacy and inevitability of man's full control of the universe through willful cognition. So what some call domination of nature. Right? He talks about faith in the legitimacy and inevitability of man's full control of the universe through willful cognition. And in order to do this, Mallin says, there has to be a regularization of the natural sinuosity of nature and the human existence in nature. a regularized version of the naturally three-dimensional sinuous world is created. So this is a kind of a three-dimensional world. I don't know how far he would want to push that identification of the sinuous as three-dimensional as opposed to the regularized line as two-dimensional, but you can go a certain distance with that. So the regularized line is two-dimensional. So what it's about for Mallin is the production of a regularized version of the naturally sinuous world, a representation of it imagistically and spatially on a kind of visual, fictional, two-dimensional plane. The sinuous is represented, okay, it's about representation. The sinuous is represented as projected forward in an out there space. See my hand, where my hand is? It's projected forward into an out there space as if separate from a viewer. So where you got the subject, the distance in the subject, and like that. The naturally sinuous, say, let's say aggregate of bumps, is projected by the dead white male anthropologist Malinowski, projected outward in front of him into an out there space as if separate from him as a series of concentric circles. Another figure that Mallin uses, I wish I could get into it more, but I don't understand it well enough, and also there's no time, but I should at least mention it. He talks about the contrast between the Greek letter chi, and he takes this not from Heidegger, but from Merleau-Ponty, who writes about the chiasm. The contrast between the Greek letter chi, is that how it's pronounced, or chi, and our Latin x. So the x is a regularized version of the chi. This one is kind of sinuous, it's three-dimensional, it's kind of unpredictable. It according to Mallin, the chiastic, relying on Merleau-Ponty, incorporates within itself the relations it has with others. And as a result of regularization, these sort of complications and regularizations or inconsistencies are pressed into a two-dimensional thing which can be viewed out in front of you. I was thinking of asking you to do this, but I'm not going to ask you to do this. I'll just say I was thinking of asking you to do this. Close your eyes. I was thinking of asking you to close your eyes and tell me what you experience when I say concentric circles of huts, and then let that go. And then I was going to ask you again to close your eyes and experience, or notice what you experience when I say aggregates of bumps. And then I was going to ask you to compare the two experiences. Now I'm going to suggest that whether or not you came up with this is what you should have, or at least could well have come up with. When I say aggregates of bumps, I'm kind of like in it. It's not out there. I'm kind of in it, and it's kind of a three-dimensional image that also has a heavy kinesthetic or feeling aspect. I can sort of feel myself in and as the aggregates of bumps. When the Choveranders say that our villages are aggregates of bumps, they're not taking themselves out of the village and looking at it as if it were out there and seeing it as concentric circles of bumps. So what you have there was a pressure on naturally sinuous reality, which excludes from it, as I was saying before, so I don't want to start repeating myself, the kind of relations and the kind of internal relations that it has with others. I'm going to come back to something like this, but I'll go back right now to paraphrasing and quoting from Mallin. So what's the purpose of this flattening out or two-dimensionalizing or representation in an out there space of the naturally sinuous goings-on at the object level? Mallin says the purpose of this is to facilitate the control and manipulation of whatever is being represented, or just its reproduction. Hey, it's a lot easier for me to just throw up a series of x's, and x is x is x is x is x is x. If you've seen one x, you've seen them all. Then to produce it's more like a Chinese character, something like that, which is more three-dimensional, which has a certain thickness. So Mallin says we end up with a cognitive reading of our milieu, which blocks a fuller existential experiencing of it. That Korzybski could almost have written those words himself. And Dorothy Lee could have written those words also if she chose to, when discussing the trope. A cognitive reading of our milieu, total domination by verbal definition, the intentional orientation. A cognitive reading of our milieu. In order to do that, we've got to step out of it and read it, as opposed to, or which blocks, I can't remember if Mallin actually uses the term blocks, but it would fit, which blocks a fuller existential experiencing of it, that is at the object level. Now Mallin says that, of course, he's going to have to say something like this, otherwise the entire apparatus of progressivism would come down on his head. He has to say that regularization was an inescapable aspect of technological and scientific progress. The regularized line is a kind of essential concomitant of the technological achievements of humanity, which have given us modernity with all of its achievements and positive features. But he suggests that the ontological movement of the next age, a very Heideggerian way of putting it, the ontological movement of the next age may be to sinuize within the record. And I relate that immediately to Korzybski's idea that you could have that kind of relationship between label and object levels in the saner human future, if there's going to be such a thing, rather than the blockage of that movement that goes with technologism. This is something written in 2003 in a law journal by a lawyer who recounts his experiences as a student in a suburban California high school in the late 50s, where he ran into general semantics as a high school student. And almost a half century later, he's writing about it in this law journal. One source of a particular intellectual tension in the school was Melvin Dolmatz, the physics teacher who taught general semantics. Mr. Dolmatz wore a white lab coat to teach and a bow tie. The school culture, in which a surprising amount of learning did go on, was dominated by cars and social hierarchy. A cult formed around the teacher Matz, a group which was out of sync with the dominant Beach Boys ethos. Their rebellion, the late 50s, their rebellion anticipated the more widely chronicled rebellion of the late 1960s. They called themselves the Matz Patrol. One of the things they did was to wear white lab coats to basketball games and sit high in the bleachers under a banner declaring their identity as the Matz Patrol. And and they would cheer. The coats were strange enough, but the cheers were really weird. They would erupt at any time. When the referee called a foul on the other team, and just as likely when a foul was called on our team. When someone made a basket from either team. When someone swept the floor. They cheered a lot when the pom-pom girls came out and jumped around in short skirts. And does that still go on? Somebody might just have scored, or maybe nobody scored, and they would yell, "The map is not the territory. The map is not the territory." That was their cheer. The map is not the territory. The map is not the territory. The Maps Patrol cheer was disconcerting to some of the other members of the high school community. It would even be disconcerting now in our high schools. In fact, maybe even more disconcerting now. I don't know. One wondered what was going on up there in the stands, while others were chanting "defense" or spelling out the name of the school in highly orchestrated chants. I suspected that the principal worried that something dirty was going on. I think parents suspected that this was some sort of attack on property. Meanwhile, the Maps Patrol simply went on chanting, "The map is not the territory. The map is not the territory." I'll give you the reference. It's called The Maps Patrol, Teenage General Semantics Rebels in a 50s U.S. high school. Oh, the school, by the way, is in Menlo Atherton High School near Palo Alto. And it's from a book, it's from an article called Unfortunate Locutions. The guy's name is John Brigham, and the journal is the International Journal for the Semiotics of Law. International Journal for the Semiotics of Law. I guess volume 16, 2003. Is there anything more? I think I better stop there. But we have some time, in fact, until 7 minutes. If anybody wants to raise a matter. Yes.
I think you're going up. I have a question to ask you. So sometimes when you're describing it, it feels like the event level is very abstract.
Well, I'm not describing. Actually, next time I'm going to talk more about the event level.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what's going to happen. It'll get even more abstract, and it'll also get even less abstract. Because it's not, you can't describe, because whatever you say about it is not it. And yet, we can talk about what our philosophies, Eastern philosophy, I'm going to rely on a lot, especially Huayan Buddhism, and the latest kind of philosophy of science, and Whitehead, what they say to us about the event level, and especially the absolute relationality as well as the event level, which is nevertheless never the same as what is going on with the event level. So hold on to your question and let's see what happens to it actually next time.